Carlo Gambino died worth over $400 million. But here's what shocked investigators most. 90% of his wealth came from legitimate businesses. This wasn't your typical gangster story. While rivals fought turf wars in the streets, Gambino was quietly buying labor unions, construction companies, and airport contracts. He turned the mafia from a criminal gang into a Fortune 500 company that happened to break the law. The transformation was so complete that even the FBI struggled to prove what everyone knew. What if I told you the man who revolutionized organized crime started as a 19-year-old stowaway hiding in a ship's cargo hold? Carlo Gambino arrived in New York Harbor in 1921, crammed between crates and machinery, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and letters of introduction to distant cousins already established in Brooklyn. The young Sicilian immigrant had grown up hearing stories about the old country's traditions of honor and respect, but America was about to teach him that survival required something entirely different. While other gangsters were getting rich quick during Prohibition, Gambino was doing something completely different. He was watching and learning. Most of his contemporaries saw the alcohol ban as a golden opportunity to make fast money through bootlegging operations. They bought trucks, hired muscle, and fought territorial wars over speakeasy distribution routes. Gambino took a different approach entirely. He got jobs in legitimate businesses and spent his days observing how real companies actually operated. Unlike his flashy contemporaries who flaunted their bootlegging profits with expensive cars and jewelry, Gambino studied the mechanics of labor negotiations. He watched construction foremen bid on city contracts and learned how union leaders controlled entire industries through strategic strikes and settlements. While other young criminals were counting bootlegging profits in back rooms, Gambino was attending labor meetings and construction site negotiations, taking mental notes on how legitimate power actually worked in America. He spent years observing these systems while others focused on speakeasies and territory wars. Gambino noticed that the real money wasn't in selling illegal alcohol. The real money was in controlling the systems that moved goods, hired workers, and negotiated contracts. He saw how a single union leader could shut down an entire construction project with one phone call. He watched how the right connections in City Hall could turn a small trucking company into a major contractor overnight. During the brutal Castellammarese War that tore through New York's Italian neighborhoods in the early 1930s, Gambino made a calculated choice that would define his entire approach to power. The conflict pitted traditional Sicilian bosses against younger, more American-influenced gangsters. Most criminals chose sides based on ethnic loyalties or personal relationships. Gambino did something different. He aligned himself not with the strongest faction, but with the smartest one. He threw his support behind the group that understood politics over pure violence. While others were stockpiling weapons and recruiting gunmen, Gambino's chosen allies were building relationships with corrupt police officials and political ward bosses. They weren't just fighting for territory. They were positioning themselves to control the systems that would matter after the shooting stopped. This early decision revealed something crucial about Gambino's mindset that separated him from every other mobster of his generation. He understood that violence was a tool, not a strategy. Real power came from making yourself indispensable to legitimate institutions. While his rivals were building criminal empires that depended on fear and intimidation, Gambino was studying how to build something that looked exactly like a legitimate business. By the 1930s, while rivals were getting arrested or killed, Gambino had quietly positioned himself as the thinking man's gangster. He had legitimate jobs, legitimate business connections, and a deep understanding of how American capitalism actually worked. His criminal activities were carefully designed to support and protect his legitimate interests, not the other way around. The stage was set for something unprecedented. A criminal who would build an empire using boardrooms instead of back alleys, corporate strategy instead of street warfare. Here's where Gambino's plan gets brilliant. He didn't just infiltrate legitimate businesses, he became them. After World War II, while America was rebuilding its economy and expanding into new markets, Gambino saw an opportunity that other crime bosses completely missed. Traditional mobsters were still thinking like criminals, looking for ways to steal from the system. Gambino was thinking like a businessman, looking for ways to own the system. Instead of competing with legitimate businesses, what if you could own them and use them as perfect cover for criminal operations? This wasn't just about having a front company to launder money. Gambino envisioned something far more sophisticated. He wanted to build legitimate businesses that were so successful and well-connected that nobody would ever suspect they were criminal enterprises. Gambino began systematically acquiring companies like Schiller and Saltstein, a labor relations firm that gave him direct access to union negotiations across multiple industries. On paper, Schiller and Saltstein looked like any other consulting company that helped businesses navigate complex labor agreements. In reality, it was Gambino's window into the inner workings of American industry. The firm's legitimate clients had no idea they were paying for services from a criminal organization. The genius wasn't just owning these businesses. The genius was how he used them to create an interconnected web of legitimate and illegitimate profit. Through Schiller and Saltstein, Gambino could influence labor disputes before they became public knowledge. He knew which unions were planning strikes, which companies were vulnerable to work stoppages, and which contractors were desperate enough to pay premium prices for guaranteed labor peace. Gambino could control hiring practices across entire industries. When construction companies needed workers, they came to his labor relations firm for recommendations. When unions needed to fill leadership positions, they consulted with his experts on labor law. He could even determine which companies got union contracts and which ones faced organized resistance. The system was so sophisticated that most participants never realized they were dealing with organized crime. He expanded this model into construction, where legitimate building contracts provided perfect cover for money laundering and extortion. Gambino's construction companies bid on real projects with real budgets and real timelines. They employed legitimate workers, used quality materials, and delivered finished buildings that met all safety codes. The only difference was that these projects also served as vehicles for washing criminal profits and establishing relationships with city officials who approved permits and contracts. The beauty of the system was that investigators couldn't tell where the legal business ended and the criminal enterprise began. When federal agents examined Gambino's financial records, they found legitimate income from legitimate contracts with legitimate clients. The criminal activities were so carefully integrated into normal business operations that proving illegal activity required months of investigation and detailed financial analysis. Gambino's construction projects created legitimate jobs for hundreds of workers who had no knowledge of any criminal connections. His companies paid taxes, carried insurance, and maintained safety standards that often exceeded industry requirements. From the outside, these looked like model businesses that were contributing positively to their communities. By the 1950s, Gambino had created something unprecedented, a criminal organization that generated more money from legal businesses than illegal ones. His empire included labor relations firms, construction companies, trucking operations, and consulting services that served clients across the eastern United States. The legitimate profits from these businesses far exceeded what traditional criminal activities could generate. This wasn't just crime anymore. It was corporate strategy with a criminal edge, a new model that would reshape organized crime for generations to come. The Peggy and Dress Company looked like any other garment business, but it was actually the nerve center of a nationwide criminal network. The small Pennsylvania factory produced women's clothing that sold in department stores across America. Workers arrived each morning to cut fabric and operate sewing machines just like thousands of other garment shops. But behind the normal business operations, Gambino was running something much more complex. Gambino understood that controlling the garment industry meant controlling one of America's largest labor forces and all the political influence that came with it. The clothing industry employed millions of workers, most of them immigrants and women who had few other employment options. These workers formed the backbone of powerful unions that could influence elections and shape labor policy. Control the garment industry, and you could control entire voting blocks in major cities. But how do you turn a Pennsylvania dress company into a tool for nationwide power? Gambino's approach was methodical and brilliant. He didn't just want to own one successful company. He wanted to create a template that could be replicated across the country, spreading his influence into every major garment center in America. Gambino used Peggy and as a model for infiltrating the entire garment district, creating a network of non-union shops that undercut legitimate competitors. While established manufacturers were paying union wages and following strict labor agreements, Gambino's shops could offer the same products at significantly lower prices. This price advantage allowed his companies to win contracts from major retailers who cared more about profit margins than labor conditions. The company became a training ground for executives who would later run similar operations across the country, spreading Gambino's influence from coast to coast. Young managers learned the Gambino method of balancing legitimate business operations with criminal activities. They studied how to maintain worker loyalty through a combination of decent treatment and subtle intimidation. They mastered the art of keeping detailed records that satisfied tax authorities while hiding the true sources of company profits. These trained executives then moved to other cities to establish similar operations. Within a few years, Gambino had connected garment shops in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Florida. Each shop operated independently but contributed to a larger network that could coordinate pricing, share market intelligence, and move products between different regions as demand fluctuated. Through forged contracts and hijacked inventory, Peggy and could manipulate prices and supply chains throughout the industry. When competitor companies were expecting fabric deliveries, their shipments might mysteriously disappear or arrive damaged. When major retailers needed rush orders, Gambino's shops could suddenly produce exactly what was needed at competitive prices. The system allowed him to create artificial scarcity or abundance depending on what served his interests. The real genius was how Gambino used these garment operations to exploit workers while simultaneously controlling the unions that were supposed to protect them. Peggy and workers received slightly better wages than typical sweatshops, which kept them loyal and prevented union organizing. Meanwhile, Gambino maintained relationships with union leaders in other shops, ensuring that competitive companies faced regular labor disputes and work stoppages. Senate investigations later revealed that this single company was connected to sweatshop operations in multiple states, all feeding profits back to Gambino. The network included cutting rooms in New York, finishing operations in Pennsylvania, and distribution centers in New Jersey. Each location appeared to be an independent business, but investigators discovered that key executives, financial systems, and supply contracts all traced back to Gambino's organization. What looked like a simple dress company was actually a sophisticated system for controlling labor, manipulating markets, and generating millions in both legal and illegal profits. Gambino had proven that with the right business model, crime could hide in plain sight. While other criminals were robbing banks, Gambino was quietly taking over one of America's busiest airports and nobody noticed for years. Idlewild Airport, later renamed JFK, was becoming a crucial hub for international commerce, and Gambino saw an opportunity that was worth more than any single heist. The airport processed millions of dollars in cargo every day. Luxury goods from Europe, electronics from Japan, and raw materials from around the world all passed through Idlewild's cargo terminals. Traditional criminals saw these valuable shipments and thought about quick smash-and-grab operations. Gambino saw something completely different. How do you steal from an airport without anyone realizing they're being robbed? The answer required thinking beyond individual thefts and focusing on systematic control. Gambino understood that airports were complex ecosystems involving dozens of different companies and hundreds of workers. Cargo moved through multiple checkpoints involving security guards, trucking companies, warehouse workers, and customs officials. Each step in this process represented an opportunity for influence and control. Gambino's strategy was masterful. Instead of stealing cargo, he took control of the systems that moved it. He began placing trusted associates in key positions throughout the airport's cargo operations. Some became security guards who could look the other way during suspicious activities. Others got jobs with trucking companies that transported goods between the airport and local warehouses. Still others worked their way into management positions at cargo handling companies that process shipments for legitimate businesses. Through carefully placed allies in airport security, trucking companies, and cargo handlers, Gambino created a criminal chokehold on legitimate commerce. His network didn't just steal individual shipments. They controlled the flow of information about what was moving through the airport and when. They knew which planes carried the most valuable cargo, which security guards were working specific shifts, and which trucking routes had the least supervision. The system generated revenue through multiple channels. Legitimate trucking contracts provided steady income and perfect cover for criminal activities. Cargo theft operations targeted specific high-value shipments based on inside information. Protection rackets offered businesses guaranteed safe passage for their goods in exchange for regular payments. Even legitimate shipping companies found themselves paying Gambino's network for services they didn't realize they were buying. Every shipment that moved through JFK generated revenue for Gambino's network, whether through legitimate contracts or criminal skimming. The beauty of the operation was its flexibility. When law enforcement pressure increased, the network could focus more heavily on legitimate activities. When opportunities arose for particularly valuable thefts, they had the infrastructure and information needed to execute complex operations without detection. The operation was so sophisticated that even when investigators suspected criminal activity, they couldn't prove which transactions were legal and which weren't. Gambino's trucking companies maintained detailed records of legitimate deliveries. His security personnel had clean backgrounds and positive performance reviews. His cargo handling operations processed thousands of legitimate shipments alongside their criminal activities. Federal investigators spent months trying to untangle the web of legitimate businesses, criminal enterprises, and corrupt relationships that controlled cargo movement at JFK. They discovered that some of America's largest corporations were unknowingly paying fees to Gambino's network through subcontractors and service providers. Airlines, shipping companies, and importers had all become unwitting participants in a criminal system that had completely infiltrated their operations. Gambino had essentially turned one of America's most important transportation hubs into a private revenue stream. This airport takeover became the template for how organized crime could infiltrate critical infrastructure without anyone realizing what was happening. The real heist wasn't stealing from the airport. It was stealing the airport itself. November 14th, 1957 started as a quiet gathering in rural New York, but it ended up exposing the biggest criminal network in American history. Joseph Barber Sr. owned a large estate in Apalachin, a tiny town nestled in the hills of southern New York. The property seemed perfect for private meetings. Rolling hills provided natural barriers against prying eyes. The nearest neighbors lived miles away. Local police consisted of just a few officers who rarely patrolled the remote area. The Apalachin Meeting was supposed to be a discreet conference where crime bosses could discuss business away from prying eyes. Barbara had hosted similar gatherings before without any problems. Crime family leaders from across America were driving to his estate to discuss territory disputes, business partnerships, and leadership changes that needed coordination between different organizations. The agenda included routine matters like resolving conflicts between families and establishing protocols for new criminal ventures. Instead, a routine police check turned into a disaster that put 65 of America's top mobsters directly in the spotlight. New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell was investigating reports of suspicious activity at local hotels when he noticed an unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state license plates heading toward Barbara's property. Croswell decided to check what was happening at the estate. When he approached the house, dozens of well-dressed men suddenly began running through the woods. The scene was almost comical. Men in expensive suits and leather shoes stumbled through thick underbrush trying to escape police attention. Some abandoned their cars and tried to hide in the forest. Others were caught trying to hitchhike on rural roads. Within hours, police had rounded up crime bosses from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California, and several other states. Most carried large amounts of cash but claimed they were just visiting a sick friend. For Gambino, who had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility, this exposure was potentially catastrophic. He had built his entire criminal empire on the principle of staying out of public view. His businesses operated quietly behind legitimate facades. His criminal activities were carefully designed to avoid attracting law enforcement attention. The Apalachin Meeting threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build. The meeting revealed the true scope of organized crime in America, a nationwide network that operated more like a corporation than a gang. Federal investigators suddenly had names, faces, and connections they'd never been able to prove before. The arrested men represented crime families from major cities across the country. Their presence together proved that organized crime was coordinated on a national level, not just local gangs operating independently. But here's where Gambino's strategic brilliance really showed. While other bosses panicked or went into hiding, he adapted. Many crime leaders responded to the increased attention by reducing their activities or moving to different locations. Some retired from active leadership roles. Others became more secretive and suspicious, which actually made their operations less efficient. The increased scrutiny forced Gambino to refine his system of quiet governance, making his operations even more sophisticated and harder to detect. He strengthened the legitimate aspects of his businesses to provide better cover for criminal activities. He developed new methods for communicating with associates that were harder for law enforcement to monitor. He created additional layers of separation between himself and illegal operations. What could have been the end of Gambino's empire instead became the catalyst for creating an even more resilient criminal organization. The Apalachin Meeting didn't destroy organized crime. It forced it to evolve into something much more dangerous. Gambino had a simple philosophy that kept him in power for decades. The prince must be fox and lion, but knowing when to be which one was the real art. This wasn't just some academic theory he read in books. This was practical wisdom that guided every major decision he made as a crime boss. Most criminals understood only one approach to problems. They relied on intimidation, violence, or brute force to get what they wanted. Gambino understood that real leadership required a completely different skill set. While rivals relied on intimidation or violence to solve problems, Gambino developed a more sophisticated approach to leadership. He studied how successful business executives managed their companies. He watched how skilled politicians built coalitions and resolved conflicts. He learned how diplomatic negotiations could produce better outcomes than confrontation. Most importantly, he recognized that maintaining long-term power required earning respect rather than just inspiring fear. How do you maintain control over violent criminals without constantly resorting to violence yourself? This was the central challenge that separated successful crime bosses from those who ended up dead or in prison. Traditional mobsters solved disputes through intimidation or elimination. Someone disrespected your family, you sent a message. Someone stole from your territory, you made an example. This approach worked in the short term but created endless cycles of revenge and retaliation. Gambino's fox side showed in how he resolved disputes through negotiation and compromise rather than bloodshed, keeping his organization stable and profitable. When conflicts arose between different crime families, Gambino positioned himself as a mediator who could find solutions that satisfied everyone involved. He understood that dead criminals generate no revenue and that wars disrupt the business operations that funded everything else. His reputation for fairness made other crime bosses trust his judgment even when they disagreed with each other. When the Gallo conflicts threatened to destabilize the entire commission in the early 1960s, Gambino mediated a solution that satisfied all parties without triggering a wider war. The dispute involved complex issues of territory, respect, and money that had been building for years. Traditional approaches would have led to a bloody conflict that could have destroyed multiple crime families. Gambino spent months in private meetings with leaders from both sides, gradually building a framework for resolution that addressed everyone's core concerns. His lion side emerged when absolutely necessary, but always calculated and precise rather than reckless or emotional. Gambino never used violence as a first option or as a way to send messages. When he authorized extreme measures, it was because all other approaches had failed and the survival of his organization was at stake. Even then, His actions were carefully planned to achieve specific objectives with minimal collateral damage or unwanted attention. This balanced approach allowed Gambino to build strategic marriages between crime families, literally marrying his son Thomas to Frances Lucchese to cement alliances. These family connections created bonds that went beyond business relationships. When crime families were connected through marriage, conflicts became family disputes that could be resolved privately rather than territorial wars that attracted law enforcement attention. The marriages also created networks of mutual obligation and shared interest that made betrayal much more costly. The result was a network of interconnected families that were stronger together than any single organization could be alone. Instead of competing with each other for the same criminal opportunities, allied families could coordinate their activities to maximize profits and minimize risks. They could share intelligence about law enforcement activities, pool resources for major criminal ventures, and provide mutual protection against outside threats. Gambino's fox and lion strategy created the most stable and profitable period in American organized crime history. He had proven that, in the criminal world, brains really could triumph over brawn. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, investigators expected his empire to crumble. Instead, they discovered he had built something that could survive without him. Most criminal organizations collapse when their leader dies because they depend entirely on one person's relationships, knowledge, and decision-making ability. Traditional crime bosses ruled through personal loyalty and fear. When they disappeared, the glue that held everything together disappeared with them. Gambino's final years were spent not just running his organization, but designing a system that would continue generating profits long after his death. He wasn't just thinking about next month's operations or next year's expansion plans. He was building institutional knowledge and creating processes that could function independently of any individual leader. This required completely rethinking how criminal organizations operated. The real test of any criminal enterprise isn't how much money it makes. It's whether it can survive the loss of its leader. History was filled with powerful crime bosses whose empires died with them. Their associates scattered to join other organizations. Their territories were carved up by rivals. Their legitimate businesses were sold off or abandoned. Gambino was determined to avoid this fate. Gambino's choice of Paul Castellano as successor revealed his ultimate strategy, prioritizing business continuity over traditional mafia values. In the old world, leadership passed to the strongest or most respected member of the family. Gambino chose differently. Castellano wasn't the toughest fighter or the most charismatic leader. He was a businessman who understood corporate structures and long-term planning. This decision shocked many traditional members who expected leadership to go to someone with stronger street credentials. The network he had built across construction, waste management, meat distribution, and international connections operated like a self-sustaining machine. Each business sector had its own management structure, profit centers, and operational procedures. The construction companies could function independently of the waste management operations. The meat distribution network didn't depend on decisions from the garment industry operations. This diversification created stability that no single criminal venture could provide. His empire stretched from New York to Cuba, from Sicily to the Bahamas, creating revenue streams that didn't depend on any single leader or location. International connections meant that even if law enforcement disrupted operations in one country, business could continue elsewhere. The geographic spread also provided multiple sources of income and different regulatory environments where various activities could flourish. These international networks included legitimate businesses that generated real profits alongside criminal enterprises. Import-export companies moved both legal and illegal goods. Real estate investments provided steady income and money laundering opportunities. Financial services helped move money between different countries and currencies. Each component strengthened the others and created redundancy that protected against disruption. Even when John Gotti later brought unwanted media attention to the family, the underlying business structure remained intact. Gotti's flashy style and public profile created exactly the kind of attention that Gambino had spent decades avoiding. The media coverage and legal pressure that followed should have destroyed the organization. Instead, the diversified business model Gambino had created absorbed the damage and continued operating. The transformation was complete. Gambino had turned a criminal gang into a corporate entity that could adapt and survive. The organization could promote new leaders, enter new markets, and adjust to changing law enforcement tactics without losing its fundamental character or profitability. Decades after his death, the Gambino model of integrating legitimate business with criminal activity remains the blueprint for modern organized crime. Carlo Gambino didn't just build a criminal empire, he created a new species of crime that continues to evolve today. Carlo Gambino's greatest achievement wasn't the money he made or the power he wielded. It was proving that crime could become indistinguishable from legitimate business. He transformed organized crime from street gangs into corporate empires that operated in boardrooms instead of back alleys. His model showed that the most dangerous criminals weren't the ones carrying guns, but the ones carrying briefcases. Today's organized crime, from drug cartels to cybercriminal networks, still follows the blueprint Gambino created: diversification, legitimacy, and strategic invisibility. The next time you see a major corporate scandal or corruption case, ask yourself, are you looking at crime that learned to wear a business suit? To wear a business suit? To wear a business suit?